All right, so this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 1, Section 2, Europe on the Brink of Change. So Section 1, 1.1, was all about the Americas, North and South America. This section will be looking at Europe. This is, of course, the chapter is focusing on before the year 1492, which was Columbus's voyage. So we're just going to take a look at what was going on in Europe in the years leading up to this consequential date. We're going to begin with the fall of the Roman Empire in 476 CE. Now, the fall of the Roman Empire is important because it meant that for the next 1,000 years or so, there was no central political control. In some senses, Europe was fragmented politically into many small different kingdoms and rulers. The time period that succeeded the Roman Empire is called the Middle Ages or the Dark Ages, stretching roughly from 500 to 1500, about 1,000 years. We sometimes refer to this as the Dark Ages because when compared with the period of Roman rule, there was just in general less knowledge, less trade, less population, less people, less literacy. In some ways, it seems sort of like a regression from times earlier. A particular event that was devastating to the European population, really just about 150 years before Columbus, was the Black Death, a disease that ravaged Europe. The Black Death was responsible for killing about 1/3 of Europeans. Died from this disease. But the ones who survived did build up some sort of immunity. And so you see an image here of some people being afflicted with the Black Death. Now, during the Middle Ages, life in feudal Europe, feudalism or feudal is sometimes a term used to describe what the political and social and economic system was like during the Dark Ages. So feudal, you might say feudalism, is sort of a social, political, and economic system. Again, recall, because there was no central political power, politics, the economy, and society were all very local, right? We might say local. So, for example, many people in Europe during the Dark Ages or during the period of the feudal system either lived in castles or manors. Now, typically these castles or manors, you can see a picture of a castle here, was owned by some sort of lord, right? So a castle and manor typically offered protection. The castle or manor offer protection and produced goods. Because there was no central ruler, trade was very risky. So pretty much everything that people consumed was either built or grown, in the castle or around the castle or on the manor. The lords, we might say of lords, they owned the land / castle, right? That was their position. Typically, the lords were the ones who were kind of on top of feudal society. The knights, they offered protection, so they offered to fight, and in return they lived at castle. And then lastly, most people who were serfs. Now, serfs or serfdom, we might say serfs or serfdom, these are the farmers. Right? Serfs, generally speaking, provided labor for the lord, offering the lord and the knights crops. And so the system worked in a way that serfs provided the food went to the knights and the lord. The lord offered protection in the castle for the serfs, and the knights also offered protection fighting on behalf of the Lord. But it still was a very violent time. Serfdom itself was a very low standard of living. In most places of Europe, wheat was the staple crop for which people sustained themselves, and also livestock. This was especially in contrast to people in the Americas, where livestock was not readily available. Things like pigs, cows, horses, goats, sheeps, right? All of these things were available in Europe, whereas they were not available in the Americas prior to 1492. Now, one point that we do want to make here is that while feudal society was very much politically, we'll say politically, fragmented, in terms of religion, it was unified. And that is to say that there were many lords, many kings, many queens. There were oftentimes battles between lords, between castles. But one thing that nearly all Europeans had in common was that they recognized the Catholic Church as the religious authority. So we might say about the Catholic Church, it was the single religious authority during the Middle Ages. Let's see, authority. And so about the church and society, the church during the Middle Ages had a very heavy influence on European society. Christianity itself, that's really what church we're talking about. So let's just make sure that we're all on the same page. Talking about Christianity. Christianity has split into different denominations and different sects over the course of time. The first major split was between the east and the western parts of Christianity. Christianity initially thrived in the Roman Empire. The way that Christianity spread was through the Roman Empire. Very early on, the Romans persecuted Christians and Christianity, but later on, Roman emperors adopted Christianity, and that really helped spread it through Europe. Spread in Europe. And even when the Roman Empire fell, that religious authority continued to exist. However, there were competing factions or competing centers for religious authority. And the first major split happened in 1054 CE. That's 500 years after the fall of the Roman Empire. We sometimes refer to this as the Great Schism. On the one side was Eastern Christianity. Eastern Christianity was led by the Patriarch of Constantinople. Constantinople is a city in what is modern-day Turkey. And one thing that differentiated Eastern Christianity was the use of the Greek language, whereas Western Christianity continued to be centered in Rome and led by someone called the Pope. Rome is in modern-day city in Italy. And was used or did use the Latin language. And so today, you can even see this split in Christianity. When you look at Christianity that is practiced in places like Russia, it is this Eastern version of Christianity. Whereas when you look for Christianity in places like Europe, it is Western Christianity, or what's sometimes called the Roman Catholic Church. So it was this version of Western Christianity led by the Pope that was the unifying factor in Europe. Now, a little bit about Christian belief, because when it comes to colonization of the New World, belief systems are important. Christian belief is heavily rooted in this duality, whether it's between good and evil, heaven and hell, God and Satan. And we'll talk a little bit more about specific Christian belief, in particular about the people who end up colonizing the New World. This belief system is very closely tied to the physical world, especially in medieval Europe. There was spiritual connotations between the physical and spiritual world. Essentially, what this means is that real world, we'll say problems, are linked to Christian belief. So one good example of this would be if, a town or a city has a bad harvest, or if a lot of people are getting sick, then that has something to do with the, overarching battle between God and Satan, that maybe Satan or the devil is responsible for some of these real world problems. Another good example might be the accusation of people being witches or heretics that was common in some of the late Middle Ages, inspired by religious belief. Christian belief is written in the Bible, so this is the book for Christianity. And one more important point is that it served as a unifying factor for Europe, especially what we're going to call Western Europe. Now, of course, I just said, or it was just mentioned, that Christianity did split between East and West in 1054, but really this sort of eastern part here, we're talking about places like, Russia, Eastern Europe, and even further east, whereas most of Europe is going to fall into this category here of Western Christianity. Most of Europe recognizes the Pope, not the Patriarch, as the supreme authority. And especially in a time period when there was no overarching political authority, it was the Pope who probably had the most or single most influence in Europe, more so than any other local king or lord or ruler. Now, a very important development in the Old World is the emergence of Islam. Islam is a religion that in some ways is very similar to Christianity, but in also other ways different. Islam was founded by Muhammad in 622 CE. He is the prophet, and he was revealed a prophecy from an angel, or the archangel, and wrote that down in the Quran. So the Quran is the holy book for Islam. And the advent of Islam and the spread of Islam put it in contention with the Christian world. And you can look at a lot of examples of various conflicts and fights between Christians and Muslims all during the Middle Ages. Some examples include the Battle of Tours, 732. The Battle of Tours was a battle between Christians. We'll say this was a battle to stop the spread of Islam in Europe. It was fought in France. And if we look at this map here, Islam originated on the Arabian Peninsula, very quickly spread throughout the Middle East, across northern Africa into Spain, and it was up here. This is where the Battle of Tours would have taken place, somewhere in here. So that was the battle that stopped the spread of Islam into Europe via Spain. Following the Battle of Tours, Catholic rulers in Spain and Muslim rulers in Spain fought what was known as the Reconquista. So this is the, in some sense, 800-year long conflict between, let's say, Muslims and Christians in Spain. So for the next 800 years after the spread of Islam into Spain, this was really an area that was a kind of continuous battleground between Christian and Muslim rulers. And maybe the most infamous and consequential of these conflicts were the Crusades, which was an effort by Christian rulers to recapture what was called the Holy Land mainly referring to the city of Jerusalem. So if we look at our map here, the Holy Land would have been located kind of in this area. And essentially it was armies from Europe marching into this area and going on a military conquest to capture the Holy Land. Now, Jerusalem and the Crusades are significant for our story here about the colonization of the New World, because in some ways it kind of gets the ball rolling in terms of explaining how Europeans came to the Americas. So like we said before, Jerusalem and the Crusades themselves were an effort by Christian rulers. We'll say rulers. To recapture, or just to capture, Jerusalem, the city of Jerusalem, which is a significant city religiously for Christians, Muslims, and Jews. And so there were a series of crusades. One of them was successful in capturing Jerusalem for a short period of time, but at the end of the day, Muslims retained control of the Holy Land. But the effects were significant. One effect here was the increase in religious persecution, not just the persecution between Christians and Muslims, but also religious minorities such as Jews. There was a very strong religious zeal that was associated with crusading. Kind of, if you don't agree with me religiously, then, I'm just going to kill you. And that very much was the mentality. But more importantly, a consequence of the Crusades was a revival in the trade between the East and the West. Recall that after the fall of the Roman Empire, for the most part, all long-distance trade ended. Most economies were local. Everything that was produced and consumed was done so on the manor, on the plot of land that the Lord owned. But the Crusades revived trade between East and West. Many goods that used to travel across the Silk Roads. The Silk Roads are trade networks. Connecting Asia with Europe. And during the Roman period, when the Romans thrived, these Silk Roads, called them because silk was one of these commodities from Asia that made its way over to Rome, those goods were available. During the Middle Ages, those goods were no longer available, mostly because Christians didn't have access to that part of the world. And there was not a lot of protection, right, or stability. It was very risky. It didn't make sense to trade. Well, the Crusades, in a lot of ways, exposed Europeans to these valuable trade goods for another time since the falling of the Roman Empire. One such traveler was Marco Polo, was a European traveler. He went to China and wrote about the wealth that was there and the trade goods, specifically things like silk, porcelain, also the rumored spice islands. Think about spices like, pepper, cinnamon, paprika, whatever sort of other spices that were not available in Europe at the time. So one of the effects here, we might say, again, about the Crusades is that it maybe re-exposed Europe to Eastern trade goods. And now it became a question of how do Europeans get their hands on these goods that, again, were rediscovered when those armies traveled east during the Crusades. How do Europeans then get their hands on them? For the most part, the Muslim world was not interested in trading with Europeans, and if they did, wanted to trade with them at a very high price, a very high markup. Muslim merchants could deliver those goods at a high markup, but Europeans wanted to get their hands on them directly. And this provided a motivation for certain countries to look for alternative ways to gain access to those various trade goods. And it was the nations on the Iberian Peninsula. The Iberian Peninsula is a geographic location which consists of the countries of Portugal and Spain. So we might say of the Iberian Peninsula, this is Spain and Portugal. That it was these nations that sought new alternative ways to get their hands on trade goods from the East. Now, one important thing to take note of is that when it comes to the first people of the Old World, or at least some of the first confirmed people from the Old World to reach the New World, is that Columbus technically wasn't the first. I just want to mention this real quickly. Leif Erikson was a Viking, approximately 1000 CE, had established a temporary settlement in what is Eastern Canada. So Vikings were poking around the Americas earlier. The issue for Leif Erikson was that he didn't really find much reason to stick around. And so he is not as significant in terms of the consequential nature of New World and Old World connection or discovery. So the Vikings established a temporary settlement, then abandoned it pretty quickly. Instead, it was Columbus that was the most consequential. So when it came to accessing trade goods in the East, it was in fact Portugal that acted first. Sometimes we call Portugal the pioneer of exploration. Their ruler, Prince Henry the Navigator, or at least one of their rulers, funded overseas exploration, shipbuilding, map making, etc., etc. And the Portuguese began sailing down south towards Western Africa. So we might say Western Africa, Portugal set up trade with Western Africa. And one difference between Portugal and the Vikings is that when the Portuguese initiated their exploration, sailing south down the coast of Western Africa, they did find something of value, and that was to trade with the Western Africans and also set up various trading locations there. The Portuguese themselves borrowed technology from around the world. Things like triangular sails allowed the Portuguese to maneuver through the seas and the winds a little bit easier. They also built smaller ships, sometimes called caravels. A caravel is a small ship that the Portuguese used. And pretty soon the Portuguese were on their way to finding perhaps a direct sea route east of Asia, eastward towards Asia. Meanwhile, Spain wanted to get in on the action as well. Spain was somewhat of a rival of the Portuguese. The modern Spanish state was created when Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand combined their crowns, creating the modern Spanish state. So Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand, we'll say these are the monarchs who created modern, not really, yeah, we'll say modern Spain. That'll be fine. All right, they created the modern Spanish state. They were very strongly Catholic. They had a crusading impulse. And in fact, some of the motivation behind Spanish exploration and even behind Portuguese exploration was this idea of finding a sea route to the Holy Land, right? Finding alternative routes to continue to crusade. Queen Isabella and King Ferdinand put forward the Inquisition, which was a religious court which persecuted non-Catholics, Jews, Muslims, and even rooted out heretics. So the religious zeal was very strong for Spain. And it was during this time that the Spanish ended the Reconquista, not only bringing that 800 long year war to an end, but in fact were victorious. So the end of the Reconquista, Christian rulers pushed the Muslims, and we'll say, and Jews, out of Spain. So that 800-year-long war between Christians and Muslims in Spain finally came to a conclusion. The Christians or Catholic side was victorious. A consequence of that was the uniting of the crowns between Isabella and Ferdinand, creating the modern Spanish state. And so Spain was ready to get in on this overseas exploration, get in on the acquisition of various trade goods. And this is where Christopher Columbus comes in. Columbus himself was a sailor, a navigator. He was somebody that could, knew his way around a ship. and he proposed an alternate route to reaching Asia. As compared to the Portuguese, instead of sailing around Africa, Columbus said that he could sail west to Asia. And that was what he claimed. Contrary to popular belief, Columbus did not, and most people did not think that the world was flat, right? That was known at the time. Anyone who sailed at the time knew that the world was round. What was controversial and where Columbus really got it wrong was with the Earth's circumference. Columbus believed, or Columbus thought, the world was smaller than it actually was. And so he thought by sailing west, so if we just do kind of a crude drawing of Europe, we'll say this is Spain, this is the boot of Italy, looks something like that. Here we have Africa, Saudi Arabia, India, right? And then this is just, and Japan's right here, right? So if this is just a crude drawing, the Portuguese, we'll go ahead and draw them in, I don't know, we'll do yellow for Portugal. Prince Henry and the Portuguese, they were sailing this way, right? And all the while setting up trading posts with Western Africa, hoping that they would one day get to Asia this way, right? And Asia's, of course, where the money is to be made. Columbus said that he could sail this way out west, right? And then just simply pop up on this side of the world. Of course, what was unknown to Columbus at the time was that there was an entire continent on this side of the world known as the Americas, right? And of course, that's what Columbus eventually ended up bumping into. And so the Spanish, we know where Columbus had gotten rejected by a number of other rulers, thinking that he was crazy. The Spanish king and queen took a chance on him and gave him 3 ships, the Nina, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, right? The 3 ships. And in 1492, he went sailing into the Atlantic Ocean, hoping that he would end up in Asia. Instead, he landed in the Bahamas, a group of islands off the coast of Florida. And so in 1492, the Bahamas was Columbus' landing location.